Hi, my name is Rick Adams from practicalcsm.com, and you are tuned into part one of a three-part podcast interview with Jake Sorofman, president of MetaCX, an Indianapolis-based startup that has raised just under $25 million to pioneer a new outcomes-based approach for managing the entire customer lifecycle by transforming how suppliers and buyers collaborate and win together. The podcast title is Why Customer Success Platforms Have It All Wrong. And without further ado, here is part one for you to enjoy. Hi, my name is Rick Adams from practicalcsm.com. And today's guest is a relatively new acquaintance for me. And in fact, this is the first time that the two of us have really spoken together. The reason we got together is that I happened to see an article he'd written and it popped up in my LinkedIn newsfeed. And busy as I was, the title was just so interesting that it made me have to go and read it. And in doing so, I found that its author had some great ideas, some of which were new to me and some of which were thoughts I also have had around the customer success management profession in general and around customer success software platforms in particular. So it seemed to me to be a no-brainer to get in touch with the author of that article and ask him if he would consider appearing as my guest on my podcast series. And I'm delighted to say that he agreed. And so here we are today. My guest's name is Jake Sorofman, and he is president at MetaCX, an Indianapolis-based startup that has raised just under $25 million to pioneer a new outcomes-based approach for managing the entire customer lifecycle by transforming how suppliers and buyers collaborate and win together. Jake Sorofman, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Rick. It's great to be here.
Thank you, Jake. And perhaps before we jump into the topic for today's podcast conversation, would you mind spending just a minute or two providing viewers with a brief overview of who you are, where you've come from, and what you do for those who perhaps have not yet come across you?
Yeah, absolutely. So my career has been a bit eclectic. If I were to pin it down to any specific theme, it would be marketing. So most recently, before I joined MetaCX, I was CMO of a company called Pendo, which was a really, really fun experience, grew very fast. You built a team from scratch. And before that, I was chief of research at Gartner. So that's the eclectic part, is I had been a CMO. I had been working with venture-backed software companies for many years. And I took a bit of a left turn and spent 5 years as an industry analyst, which was a fascinating experience. And so glad I did it. But I did come back to my roots. And then most recently, I joined MetaCX as president. So I'm responsible for all of our go-to-market functions: sales, marketing, customer success, technical support, professional services.
Yeah, well, so president is one of those titles, isn't it? There's actually, you do kind of need to explain it because
it could mean a lot of things, couldn't it? Yeah.
So thank you for that, Jake. Yeah. Okay. So, and yeah, I agree with you. I mean, it's an interesting, eclectic bunch of experiences, which I'm sure all sort of go in then to inform, you know, who you are today and what your decision-making processes are, and and so on. So, great.
I sure hope so.
Sorry, go ahead.
I sure hope so.
So our title for today's conversation is to my mind, refreshingly controversial: Why Customer Success Platforms Have It All Wrong. So as you know, Jake, I've read your article, which shares the same name, with great interest, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to discuss some of its contents with you today. Before we jump into discussing what you believe is wrong with the current customer success software offerings that we see around us, let's start with a little bit of background. And in your article, you talk about 4 fundamental flaws in conventional customer success thinking. And these are: number 1, the tyranny of busy; number 2, adoption and sentiment as false measures of value; number 3, health scores as a false measurement of risk; and finally, number 4, customer success as a role instead of a goal. So let's go through these, a little bit first, just to set the scene, starting with your first fundamental flaw, which is the tyranny of busy. Please explain what you mean by this.
Yeah, so, just broadly, and I'm so glad you read the article. Thanks for your interest. I think that customer success platforms have been a half measure. They're a step in the right direction, but they're missing the bigger point of what it takes to really systematically create customer success within organizations. So that first point, the tyranny of busy, is really, when you focus on the task management and workflow, you can create the illusion of productivity and effectiveness where you're not necessarily aligned with what the customer needs and the business needs. So you can lull yourself into a false sense of confidence that the right work is getting done because you finish the day feeling satiated, satisfied, fulfilled, but you're not necessarily focused on the highest value activity on behalf of the customer or the business.
So you could even finish the day exhausted.
100%.
And what you're saying is that activity is not the same thing as results.
Activity doesn't equal output, and output doesn't equal outcomes. So,
Right.
being able to trace the thread all the way to the customer outcome is really what customer success is about. And I think that customer success platforms today really focus on activity, even more so than outputs, and certainly not outcomes.
Right. And I think that all three of those, as you say, they're all different, because you could have outputs, which you could say, well, that's progress. Okay. So you could have activity that doesn't lead to any outputs, no progress is made. You could have activity that leads to outputs, progress is made, but you could still be asking yourself the question, yes, but is it in the right direction? Yeah.
You got it.
Okay, so next up in terms of flaws comes adoption and sentiment as false measures of value. So tell us a little bit about where the flaw is there, please.
So I mentioned I had worked at a company called Pendo, and Pendo was focused on product analytics and guided user engagement. So a key part of Pendo's value was understanding whether tools were being adopted and ensuring that users were using them in the right ways. So establishing the right habits within your user base, which I'm a big believer in. And I think it's a necessary precondition of value realization. But it alone doesn't tell you that value realization has occurred. It is the first step to ensuring that your customers are getting value from your product. And I reference an example, an anecdote that was shared with me recently from a CSM manager who told me about a time that he and his team were renewing a large account, and they were fully confident going into that conversation that the customer would renew because their adoption and usage rates were through the roof. So they had no reason to believe otherwise. But it was a surprise churn.
So
a surprise churn.
They checked.
I'm sorry?
Until they checked in on outcome creation again, as you were describing earlier.
That's exactly right. There's other dynamics within the business that were the reason that customer churned. Just the fact that they were using the product, they were consuming the licenses, did not mean that they were seeing value, and even more importantly, seeing differentiated value.
Hi, and apologies for interrupting this recording, but I just wanted to ask you a favor. If you are a CS team leader and you've not already done so, please would you consider completing our customer success training and certification requirements survey. It's not too onerous a task, and indeed the feedback from CS leaders has been very positive, with some of them saying that the act of completing our survey form made them think more deeply about their team's training requirements than they had previously done. All participants will, of course, receive a copy of our final report, which we'll be publishing at the end of Q1. And you can also optionally choose to receive a free 30-minute coaching session and customized report that compares your responses to the average responses, if you wish to. To find out more and to complete the survey, please go to practicalcsm.com/survey2021. Thank you very much. It's such a great point. It's so obvious when you think about it. It's just so obvious. So I recall listening to salespeople in the world of Cisco selling their devices. This was a little while back. Selling their devices such as routers and switches and firewalls on the basis of how much more enjoyable they were to use than the average piece of hardware. The only thing is, of course, is that the people who are making the purchasing decisions couldn't care less.
Couldn't care less.
No. Could not care. So the fact that the systems engineer who gets to use the piece of equipment, that their sentiment's gone through the roof, and they're logging in all the time and tweaking it and playing about with it, does not mean that it's generating any more value than the previous tool that they hated and therefore left alone to get on with it.
That's exactly right. I'd say in the case of adoption, it's necessary but insufficient. In the case of sentiment, it can lull you into a false sense of confidence.
Right. So I would go along with that. I would say adoption actually is a KPI, but it's not the only KPI.
That's
and
right.
like finding yourself on a map, you have to triangulate.
That's exactly right.
One data point is not sufficient to tell you where you are on the map, and but nevertheless, it's a good start. Okay, so number 3 on your list, Jake, is health scores as a false measurement of risk. So please explain where you believe health scores are going wrong.
Health scores are tricky. So you're essentially trying to take a very complex, multidimensional relationship and reduce it to a single number. Let that sink in for a second. That I think that alone kind of makes the point that health scores are insufficient, and they can absolutely steer you in the wrong direction. I've heard so many stories about and seen firsthand health scores creating false positives and starting to create sort of this misalignment within an organization around what the real truth is with respect to customer health. And the way that manifests is you see health scores showing up within dashboards. And I've experienced this, where executives are reviewing customer health in aggregate at a very high level. And then you have CSMs who feel fundamentally differently because they have a different read on the account. And it reminded me, and I wrote about this a little bit in the article, of one of the first principles of aviation, which is trust your instruments. So
how interesting.
Yeah, when the pilot has just based on like intuition, reflex, has a different view than what the instrument tells them, bad things happen. But the data needs to be accurate.
That's really, really interesting. So I completely get where you're coming from on this, and there are all sorts of sort of examples again that I can think of. But the concept of a health score, as you say, my customer is a huge multinational corporation who spends hundreds of thousands of dollars with us. And how are you getting on with them? Oh, they're a 7.3. Are they? And what does that actually mean? And as you say, it's far too complicated as a start point. But I think that there are a number of risks around health scores. So, for example, you were talking about the difference between the executive looking at the health score and the CSM looking at the health score. Mm-hmm. But I think there is a danger of is where we forget as an organization that the data is just the data, and we start thinking that we're here to make the data look good.
You got it.
And so the job of the CSM stops being creating value for customers and starts being raise your average 7.3 to an 8.2. Mm-hmm. And those two things, in theory, you could say, well, aren't they the same? But actually, no, they're not the same, because you could raise them from a 7.3 to an 8.2 in all sorts of ways that are completely unhelpful to the customer. And if you are now spending your time doing that, because that's how you're measured and that's how you're rewarded, so why wouldn't you?
That is classic metrics dysfunction. Where the metric goes, the effort flows. And if that metric is wrong, guess what?
Right.
People are going to orient around the wrong thing.
All right. Well, we're doing all right so far. Let's try your 4th fundamental flaw. Is customer success... sorry, let me start again. Your 4th fundamental flaw is customer success as a role instead of a goal. So I've actually got my own opinion on this one that I'm going to interject in a minute, and it may not be the same as yours, so we'll see. But please give us a brief explanation of what you think is happening and where you see things going wrong here.
Yeah, so and this comes back to the point that I made that customer success it's often implemented today as a half measure. We're looking at it too narrowly and too tactically. We're treating it as simply deploying a function for managing renewals and ensuring that revenue is resilient over time, which is really the right goal. But how we go about it, I think, is wrong. And it's because expectations are set within a sales cycle. The handoff is often very broken. So there's this disconnect that's happening between what's promised to the customer and what the delivery team is and knows about and is set up to deliver on behalf of the customer. And then the ability to look back to see that those things were actually achieved on behalf of the customer. So the fact that there isn't this steel thread in the relationship oriented around a set of promised outcomes means that there's often miscommunication and misalignment between the various stakeholders responsible for creating that value on behalf of the customer. So at renewal time, it's almost like the die has been cast and it's too late. So I see customer success teams, I think they're, generally speaking, among the most empathetic, diligent, and committed humans within any SaaS business. I've always been a very big fan of customer success people because I think they really care. I think their intentions are generally in the right place.
Definitely.
But they're often set up to fail. You see them trying to kick save deals and do the diving catch to try to make good things happen. But that's all on the basis of retroactively painting a picture of value with incomplete data, with incomplete understanding of what expectations were set, what promises were made. So this is a long-winded way of saying that customer success is really not just a role within the organization, not just the nice people down the hall, but a shared cross-functional goal of the organization. Okay. That seems obvious enough until you start looking at how most companies are organized today, and you'll see that it is very much not the case that they treat it that way. They do treat it as a role more than a goal.
Okay. So much to unpack here. So, yeah, I don't disagree with anything that you've said, actually. I find myself very comfortable with all that you've said. So I do sometimes find people asking me a question. Okay, that's it for part one. Please subscribe at practicalcsm.com/member to be updated when part 2 gets released, or alternatively, subscribe on the YouTube channel and then hit the bell icon to be notified whenever a new video is published. See you soon for part 2.